Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of this book, Custom Air Suspension, how you can fit air suspension to your car. What I want to do in today's video is talk about one of the misconceptions that I think is very widespread about air suspension. Only one of the misconceptions? I think there are lots of misconceptions, but this is one of the key ones that people don't understand. They don't understand one of the major advantages of air suspension over steel spring cars. So let's start off by talking about steel spring cars, cars with conventional suspension. The car's sitting there. You hop into the car and the car settles a little bit on its springs. It compresses the springs a small amount. Another person gets into the car settles a little bit further on its springs. So the deflection, the static deflection of the suspension is dependent on the load in the car. So what, you might say? Well, each time the car settles a little bit on its springs, it's using up some of its capacity to absorb bumps. Let's take a real-world example. You're driving on the road, you hit a corner, you're going pretty hard, there's a mid-corner bump. Now, the car will have rolled slightly, all cars roll, irrespective of the stiffness of the anti-roll bars. You've used up some of the suspension travel through the load getting into the car, and then you've used up some of the suspension travel on the outside wheels by the car rolling a little. Then you hit that bump. What happens? You've used up all your bump travel and the bump rubbers get impacted, the bump stops get impacted. The suspension rate, the stiffness of the springs dramatically changes because bump stops are so much stiffer than the normal springs. What happens to the car's behaviour? It skips sideways. In the worst scenario, it skips off the road. We've all felt how a car can be discombobulated by those mid-corner bumps, and it's typically because you've used up a lot of the suspension travel. Now compare that with air springs. The car's sitting there again, you get into the car settles a little bit on the air springs, and then the compressor starts or the valve opens and it pumps it back up. Another person gets into the car, the same thing happens. It moves back to the same ride height. You put a big load in the trunk, in the boot, the same thing happens. You are not using up any of your static suspension deflection. You're not using up any of your bump absorption capability. You hit the same mid-corner bump and you've got the same amount of bump absorption as you would have had if the car were empty. So, one enormous advantage is not just ride levelling, but the fact that that ride levelling keeps your same amount of bump absorption as if the load were not even there. The second advantage flows from that. It's a little bit more subtle. The effective stiffness of the suspension in a car is really heavily dependent on what's called that static deflection, how much the springs settle when the load is aboard. The greater the static deflection, the softer the suspension actually behaves. What's called, it has a lower natural frequency. So if you put 4 people in the car, in a steel spring car, your suspension acts as if it's now much softer than if only one person were in the car. And think about it, it's the wrong way around. If you have a bigger load in a car, you want the springs to be stiffer to better control that load. And of course, stiffer damping. That's the other thing that's also a bit of a worry because the damping typically doesn't change. It remains the same, but now you've got softer springs. So, or effectively softer. Now what happens with air suspension? Because the ride height does not change, it pumps itself up or releases air to drop it depending on which way the load's going, getting in, getting out, then the natural frequency changes very, very little. You can say effectively changes not at all. So the spring stiffness, the effective spring stiffness stays the same irrespective of the amount of load in the car, and the amount of bump absorption you've got stays the same irrespective of the amount of load you've got in the car. Both of those things pay huge dividends in terms of ride and in terms of handling. Now, that's why manufacturers like Cadillac, that's why manufacturers like Tesla, that's why manufacturers like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Porsche, all use air suspension on their top-line cars because they can get the best ride and handling compromise, especially if it's the sort of car which is going to have widely diverging loads. You know, it might have 4 people in the car, might have only 1 person in the car. And here's one other thing before I leave you. If you've got a small, lightweight car, that becomes even more critical because the proportion of the car's weight, which is a varying load of people getting in and out, luggage getting in and out, or you putting the luggage in and out, that proportion is even a greater amount. And so you're fighting it even harder to try and maintain the same ride height and therefore have that same bump absorption and to not have great big variations in natural frequency and effective stiffness of the springs. The book's called Custom air suspension, it covers how to put air suspension in your own car. It also covers some of these theoretical aspects like natural frequency, like bump absorption and so on. And I recommend the book to you. Thank you.